What's up, gang? Thanks for joining the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson. And I wasn't going to do an episode today. It's Halloween season and a lot of shit going on. And I had shared a free episode of the Bang Bang podcast to tide you over. But this China US summit between Trump and Xi Jinping in South Korea took place on Thursday. It's their first in person meeting in 6 years. And it's the culmination of like a lot of back and forth as part of what you could either call great power competition or inter-imperial rivalry, which is the same thing, right? The former is the latter. But I'm seeing like so many smart commentators and dumb commentators characterize this meeting and this deal and US China policy in ways that are just like the narrative of least resistance. Like they're like too credulous in a way, or like overly simple. Like basically, I I'm seeing like a lot of bad hot takes about this, and like there's so much at stake because it is the two great powers of the world system. I want to, and like people were asking me how I made sense of it and how that differed from what other people were saying. So I wanted to jump on the mic and kind of address that, of course. And I think the bottom line, it's tactical détente, right? It's not the strategic détente. It's not the great power détente that the world needs, that the U.S. needs, that American and Chinese workers need. But it's not nothing. Uh, and any day when China hawks are, upset is not a bad day. So like something's going modestly right. That you can find some solace in the fact that people like Matt Pottinger are like pissed and worried and fretting and that kind of thing, right? When like right before the summit started, Trump issued a tweet or Truth Social thing where he described the meeting that was about to happen as a G2. And it's fascinating. People are making a lot of this, and I think it's not necessarily warranted, even though it's a positive thing. So a G2 is also referred to as a great power condominium, which is also referred to as a form of international order where the largest powers in the system hash shit out together, right? Rather than see international order descend and fall apart into block politics, like the style of the Cold War. It's a way of like, managing the issues that arise, and international order being the result of the great powers managing those issues. 15 years ago, like when I was in the Obama administration, there was talk of a G2 for a little while. And then Obama went in a very different direction. Xi Jinping went in a different direction in his own way. And so, even though China had wanted a G2, the US resisted it. And one of the reasons the US resisted a G2 in the Obama years was because we still insisted on US primacy. A G2 implies kind of like co-management or like co-maintenance, which is to say that like you're treating the other as a kind of equal to you, which means you should be accepting mutual vulnerability with them at the level of their nuclear arsenals, and you should be accepting a kind of a balance of power with them as in equilibrium, as in not a favorable imbalance of power, but as in word and in deed. Obama's grand strategy was favorable imbalance of power. It was primacy, it was military superiority. And because of that, we could not accept China as any kind of sovereign equal, right? So the G2 thing got shelved. And then, of course, by 2015, we were in great power competition. Trump 1.0 just went gangbusters with that. And then Biden doubled down on that. And we get the era of great power competition, such as it was. And we're still in that era, although shit is changing very rapidly. And I have a piece in the newsletter that kind of walks through what has and has not changed. Basically, it's a category error or a misnomer to say that the Trump administration is not doing great power rivalry or inter-imperial rivalry. They absolutely fucking are. Absolutely. There's no question about it. But that's not all they're doing. And they're not doing it well. They're not doing it, intelligently. Um, So, anyways, that's in the newsletter. But this G2 thing, so like there was a time when China really wanted the G2 construct, and in a way, maybe it still does. I think for now, they're happy to have America see them basically as equals. If in 2010 or so, if you would have described a G2, or if the US president acknowledged a G2 arrangement internationally with China, it would have had tremendous weight. Now, 15 years on, that same rhetoric does not pack the punch. Like, rhetoric doesn't have the same weight or meaning as it would have in an earlier era, because we're in the era of like memes and shit posting and the facts just dissolving in front of our eyes, right? So like Trump says one thing one day, and then he's hot one day, he's cold the next day, right? He says things that literally don't make sense all the time. You know, I don't know if we're going to get to it today, but his announcement about resuming nuclear testing, which is part of the larger bargaining, tableau in Sino-US rivalry, right? But like his announcement was predicated on a series of like justifications that were false, that were like not true, which is to say that like the one of the most consequential decisions you can make with the fucking ultimate weapon, the resumption of nuclear testing, on the basis of like non-facts, on the basis of like disinformation, propaganda, whatever. So it's in that context where we're just swimming in false information constantly, that now Trump says G2. He can reverse that at a moment's notice also, which further dilutes the power of the rhetoric. But I'm not mad at it. I'm not mad at it. The great power narcissism is going to have some consequences, and maybe we'll talk about that as well. But better to have a positive valence in great power relations than a negative valence. That's the whole point of my book, The Rivalry Peril, with Mike Brannis. So whatever we can do to get to sort of balance positive relations with the other, not just the other great power of the international system, but like increasingly the dominant power, right? Like the balance of power in many ways, not just in one way, has shifted between China and the US. And I think that's a little bit worth talking about as well, because we see it in evidence in this summit meeting in a way, right? So to get to the deal real quickly, what happened, right? Both sides agreed to suspend the recently announced export controls on both sides for 1 year, right? Suspend the new fees on shipping for 1 year. The US cut by 10 percentage points the tariffs that it put on Chinese goods related to fentanyl, right? So there was this 20% extra tariff that's cut in half, more or less, right? So now the average US tariff on China has dropped, not a lot. I mean, from like 18% to 17% on average, right? And China has agreed to drop investigations into a bunch of US tech companies. So Nvidia, Micron, Intel, Broadcom, TI, Texas Instruments, and then did I say Qualcomm? Anyway, and then I think that the big deliverable from Trump's perspective is to undo the harm that his own policies, did to farmers. So China agreed to resume soybean purchases. And I mentioned this in a recent episode. We covered the whole soybean saga, but China's soybean purchases from the US dropped to zero in May this year. They've been zero ever since. And this is putting the squeeze badly on American soybean farmers in Iowa and Missouri, I think it is. Oh, and then the reason for that was Trump's tariffs and export controls. And so for consumers, this deal between China and the US, this summit, it doesn't really do anything other than prevent the global financial system from collapsing. For farmers, it's sort of good news, resumption of purchases. China has like communist, nominally communist country. They do 5-year plans. China's next 5-year plan emphasizes increasing domestic demand, which is to say domestic consumption. It has like a not so great track record of increasing domestic consumption because of its model of capturing surplus value, of capturing profit. Like it sort of artificially depresses worker wages. This is a controversial thing to say, I think, for some people, but it is what it is. China recognizes that it has a problem and it's trying to fix it. So hopefully it can succeed. But part of having a 5-year plan that says we need to increase domestic consumption is possibly having more American shit, American agriculture especially, might find greater market share in China. That's the carrot. That's the promise that China is kind of holding out. And it's plausible, it's foreseeable, and China can subsidize domestic consumption. So, what the irony of this is that in the context of China's increasing tech dominance, its smart investments, and you can't predict innovation, but it has had some major successes in innovating and creating entirely new economic sectors and things like the drone economy and stuff. So China is becoming this advanced, more than an advanced manufacturer. It's becoming like an advanced economy, like information economy and services economy too, right? And America is falling back on relying on agricultural exports, okay? Objectively, from a capitalist world system, from a world systems analysis perspective, the countries that rely on agricultural exports and commodity exports are usually way down the value chain, right? I don't want to exaggerate this because America still has the lion's share of like productivity and global services, and it has for now occupies a dominant part of the semiconductor supply chain, production chain. So there are advanced aspects to the American economy still, but we're relying more and more on a kind of primitive is not the right word, but like on a more basic or low value add productivity, which is trying to do manufacturing, although not succeeding at it, and then focusing on agriculture, which is low value add, low profit. And that is what, the third world and the global south has relied on to get by, and that's, this America is like rapidly declining in just like visible, measurable ways, and the focus on ag is one indicator of that, of many, right? So Trump has managed to do a deal with China that reverses the damage that his own policies did to America's, not economy, because the economy is still shit, but farm industry at least, right? So, and then there was supposed to be, the reason I call this a tactical detente is that the NVIDIA Blackwell chips, right? This is the thing that everybody was focusing on. Trump said NVIDIA's chips, whether they can be sold to the China market, these are advanced chips that China, for the time being, needs. But if you fast forward 5, 10 years, probably doesn't need. So in the near term, they're a source of leverage and advantage for the US, one of America's only sources of leverage in relationship to China. So a bunch of China hawks, all the China hawks, they're apoplectic about the possibility that NVIDIA's Blackwell chips could be sold to China, right? It would undermine the entire point of the whole like chips and science acts in the Biden years, Bidenomics, small yard, high fence, all that, all the shit that America has done to move toward economic decoupling and economic containment. It's all kind of like, to me, it's pointless to begin with. But from their perspective, the Hawks' perspective, it is totally pointless if we sell these chips to China. So that was on the table, and Trump said it would be discussed with China. It was not mentioned so far as part of what was agreed to, right? If you came to agreement on that, or if you came to agreement on Taiwan, you would have something fundamental, or on nukes. That would be like a strategic detente, right? That's not where we're at. Not even close. So it's worth maybe walking through like how did we get here in the span of less than a year? You know what I mean? Because this is the fourth time in 10 months, 9 months, yeah, 10 months, that China and the US have had like a back and forth of coercion, counter coercion, and then some kind of truce. And so this all kicks off with Trump's quote unquote Liberation Day tariffs. That's in April. And then he announces 145% tariffs on China. China immediately retaliates, which is like actually reciprocal tariffs. Trump says his tariffs are reciprocal, but that's, again, disinformation. So then China responds, and America realizes immediately it doesn't have the cards, and so the US backs down, drops the 145% tariffs down to, I think, something like 45%. And then there were two other rounds of this type of interaction around, mostly focused on export controls. And then on September 29th, the US has this, we talked about this in a previous episode, but the US has this Bureau of Industry and Security, I think it's called, this Commerce Department instruction that puts export control restrictions on like thousands of subsidiaries of Chinese companies, right? Bars them basically from getting access to US semiconductor technology. And so in response to that, within a week and a half, 2 weeks, China announced just sweeping new export controls on rare earths that it didn't bar the rare earths, but it set up controls that would require getting certain approvals to get rare earths from China. And since China has a stranglehold on not just accessing the rare earth minerals, but processing them, and these things are crucial inputs to America's economy and America's military, incidentally, weapon systems, the US freaked out and started looking for an off ramp. And that's literally what led to this summit. That's where we're at now. It's all very tactical and transactional. And it's awesome that it's stable, And in fact, maybe I should play a short clip of like Xi Jinping and Trump talking at the summit. You see a genuine rhetorical shift compared to Trump 1.0, but also compared to just like Sino-US relations the past 20 years.
Some discussions. I think we've already agreed to a lot of things, and we'll agree to some more right now. But President Xi is a great leader of a great country, and I think we're going to have a fantastic relationship for a long period of time. And it's an honor to have you with us. Thank you very much.
President Trump, it is a great pleasure for me as well to meet you. And it feels very warm seeing you again because it's been many years. Since your re-election, we have spoken on the phone 3 times, exchanged several letters, and stayed in close contact. And our joint guidance, China-US relations have remained stable on the whole. Given our different national conditions, we do not always see eye to eye with each other, and it is normal for the 2 leading economies of the world to have frictions now and then. You and I, at the helm of China-US relations, should stay the right course and ensure the steady sailing forward of the giant ship of China-US relations. I always believe that China's development goes hand in hand with your vision to make America great again. Our 2 countries are fully able to help each other succeed and prosper together. Over the years, I have stated in public many times that China and the United States should be partners and friends. This is what history has taught us and what reality demands. A few days ago, in the latest round of consultation, our 2 economic and trade teams reached basic consensus on addressing our respective major concerns and made encouraging progress. This provided the necessary conditions for our meeting today. Mr. President, I am ready to continue working with you to build a solid foundation for China-US relations and create a sound atmosphere for the development of both countries.
That's what it looks like to do a G2, at least in terms of the rhetoric. Like, it's issue management literally. It's we can hash this shit out together. Xi Jinping had some metaphor about like we're the two people that are steering the ships of state or something like that. All that's all good. I mean, one, Xi Jinping is both right and it's worrying when he says he wants to make China's development sort of synergistic with or compatible with Make America Great Again, MAGA, right? Because this is like the kind of reactionary collusion, Chinese exceptionalism and American exceptionalism, right? But effectively right wing projects in both countries, right? And then subordinating everything else to that, and they can get along as long as those two political projects are advancing. So that's a little concerning, and I can address that more at a separate point. There's two major things to worry about here, and it has to do with understanding the nature of inter-imperial rivalry, right? So one is that because this is a tactical détente, not a strategic détente, it's temporary, right? This effectively kicks the can down the road, and I will fucking take it. Great. But there is only really one export at this point that America has like a sort of permanent advantage in, and that is the will to violence. America owns a greater share of global death dealing than like anyone. And between nuclear tests, Golden Dome, Golden Fleet, $1 trillion war budget, Space Force, illegal wars in Latin America, there is no sign of this, U.S. export of violence changing. And that could disrupt everything at a moment's notice. As soon as violence is put in service of clashing interests with China, we're all dead, right? The other thing to worry about is that the sources of inter-imperial rivalry are structural, and they were not addressed at all in anything that happened in this meeting or in their agreement or in the ongoing deal, right? So I have a 1-minute clip where I explain what I mean when I say that the sources of inter-imperial rivalry are structural, because I say it A, all the time, but B, people have asked me what I mean by that on occasion, and like I hate just explaining myself over and over and over. So I'm just going to play this real quick, and then I'm going to unpack it.
In order to do state-driven capitalism, you end up having to exploit nationalism. There's an ideology that has to do work there. So using state power, you build national power, you strengthen yourself, you weaken your competitors. But as I'm sure some of you know, nationalism is a pretty dangerous force. It's prone to a politics of reaction. It isn't, by definition, exclusionary. It often assumes scarcity, particularly about things like security, and it becomes a justification for violence against those that you've ring-fenced on the outside, right? And in the US and China in particular, this force is ethnically charged. It's ethno-nationalism, right? In both countries, nationalism has an exceptionalist quality. They both talk and sometimes act as if they are special, as if they have some kind of divine right? As if their behavior is exempt from the rules that everyone else plays by. Great power exceptionalism of this kind is nothing new, but it could coexist in a high-growth world. It wasn't a source of World War III in a high-growth world. We're not in a high-growth world anymore, right? So what we're left with is militarism and economic nationalism, and who benefits from that? Not lovers of democracy, not lovers of peace, and not workers.
That was my spiel. That was from a talk I gave last year, a public lecture, public talk at the New Zealand Fabian Society. But the gist, right? As long as the capitalist world system has declining growth prospects, and as long as the U.S. refuses to relinquish its formal sphere of influence in the Pacific Islands, inter-imperial conflict just endures. It just is what it is, right? Now, what is the main site of inter-imperialist conflict? Right now, it's Taiwan, right? But if we resolve Taiwan in some way, and that could be any number of ways, it could be the horrific way of like abandoning Taiwan or making Taiwan part of a Chinese sphere of influence. It could be in some peaceable way where like they, peaceful unification somehow happens. But one way or another, if we take Taiwan off of the board, basically as a site of conflict, or we come to some kind of understanding that stabilizes cross-strait relations, inter-imperial rivalry doesn't go away. And again, this is why the deal that was just made between China and the US is like so infinitesimally small. Positive, but small, right? They didn't even address Taiwan. But assuming that they get there, assuming the G2 builds toward making some kind of strategic progress, the line of conflict shifts from Taiwan to further out to the second or third island chains, which means like Oceania, which means the Pacific Islands region, right? We would end up going from we resolve Taiwan, but inter-imperial conflict just shifts from East Asia to basically the Pacific Islands. And Pete Hegseth, he met with his PLA counterpart. Interestingly, you can see it in the picture. Bridge Colby was not present. The Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, also the most famous China hawk in the Trump administration, not at this meeting. Is that an incidental or is that intentional? A signal? Who the fuck knows? I don't know. But just quickly, Hegseth said, today I met with Chinese Minister of National Defense Admiral Dong Jun on the sidelines, blah, blah, blah. It was a good and constructive meeting. He said he highlighted the importance of maintaining a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific and emphasized U.S. concerns about China's activities in the South China Sea, Taiwan, toward allies. U.S. does not seek conflict. It will continue to stoutly defend its interests, blah, blah, blah. This is nothing here is surprising. The rhetoric about balance of power is not new. What's key here, I saw this get misinterpreted by some people. When Hegseth says he wants the US to maintain a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, he still means favorable balance of power, not an equilibrium or an equal distribution of power, right? So he seeks still imbalance of power. And the reason that we know that is what America's buying and investing in militarily. The Department of fucking War is spending the $1 trillion war machine on stuff mostly to fight China. The force structure, capability, and capacity that they're buying, the technology, the weapon systems, and then the force posture that goes with that in East Asia and the Pacific. It's all meant to overmatch China still in Taiwan. There's an alternative future where that overmatch is meant to defeat China outside of Taiwan geography, maybe the South China Sea, maybe the Pacific Islands or something, right? But that's right now the more ambitious benchmark for military superiority is Taiwan, and that's where DoD and where the US and where Hegseth is focusing. So when Hegseth says maintaining a balance of power, we should want him to mean that literally, as in a balance of power. But right now, there is no evidence that that's what he means at all. He means a favorable imbalance of power still. Okay, so don't invest too much in Hegseth's rhetoric. You could invest a little bit in the fact that Bridge Colby is not there. That's interesting, right? And then the final thing I wanted to say about all of this, I guess this is like the so what, or like how do we unfuck this? So there's only 3 ways to address the root structural sources of inter-imperial rivalry, right? One is to get the global economy growing again, which means doing the opposite of everything we're doing now, right? America, the capitalist core, is in a recession. It's on the verge of a Great Depression. That's obviously going to be bad for global growth. And that means it's going to be also bad for great power rivalry. So that's probably not on the table right now. The global economy and its growth trajectory is a source of intensifying conflict, not a source of stabilization. 2, used to demilitarize state capitalism, right? In a world of no growth prospects, there is no alternative to state capitalism, right? Industrial policy, all that stuff. But there's no reason state capitalism has to invest in the war industry, in the defense industrial base, right? That does not necessarily follow, right? Just because we're doing state capitalism doesn't mean Palantir and Boeing have to be like the big winners, right? So demilitarized state capitalism. This is another way of addressing the root sources of inter-imperial rivalry. And then the third way of addressing the structural sources of inter-imperial rivalry is to change international order. The idea of a G2 starts to move in that direction, but much more besides would have to happen, right? The most peaceful way to change international order is specifically to make the Pacific Islands region an open, autonomous region, which it is not. It's not even close to that right now, right? Asserting US primacy in the Pacific, which is what Biden did and Obama did and what Trump is doing right now, asserting US primacy there antagonizes China's emerging sphere of influence, right? Empires end up in conflict when their spheres of influence collide. So the US has to give up its sphere of influence in the Pacific in order to short circuit inter-imperial rivalry. And yes, the US has a sphere of influence in the Pacific and actual colonies, okay? Anybody who's been on this show or my newsletter long enough knows this as fact, okay? So that's where we're at. That's tactical détente. Totally sidesteps, fails to address the root sources of great power rivalry. That's unfortunate and disconcerting. And the Trump administration is a den of fucking hawks. So like, not great. But as long as Trump is alive, we have this interpersonal relationship of smoothness, of détente, tactical level stability, you know? So we'll take it. See, at a minimum, we're not going to World War III today, but we have done nothing to suspend the process of propelling down the path of World War III. Okay. So that's all I got for today. Hope you enjoy your holidays and all that shit, and I'll catch you real soon. All right, peace.